Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to risk starting bang on time just because I know that the next session is going to run the risk of running longer because it's going to be very interesting, it's very timely and very topical session for us all, not least because of the updated budget outcome yesterday, which I'm sure Chris will speak to. I know Chris doesn't need much introduction to any audience in Australia, much less an audience like this one, so I won't go into great lengths. He is, of course, well known for his fantastic contributions through Deloitte Access Economics and his many engagements with the media. I do also have to point out that he is an incredibly tall and handsome market economist, and that's one of the things that makes him stand out the most. You can pay me. Which is, of course, why he's got such a great media profile. I've known Chris for a long time. I've always enjoyed my engagements with him, and I'm sure you will enjoy your engagement with him today. We're going to take questions from the floor and questions from the iPad. I'm going to warn you now that there is a great risk that Chris and I will just sit up here and have a conversation. So when you want to ask a question, jump up and down and raise your hands and make sure we notice you, or send them through ASAP on the app, because otherwise you're going to miss your chance. So with that, let me please welcome to the podium Chris Richardson.
Many thanks, Melinda, and many thanks to CEDA for having me along. 40 years as a magnificent institution fighting for a better Australia, and I was talking a moment ago up here to Melinda about that. In Australia and around the world, fighting the good fight for a better future is getting harder. It's central to your heart and to your mission. It's central to the heart and the mission of Deloitte Access Economics too. And it's actually going to be a bit of what I'm talking about today. I'll talk about some of the current issues, some of the current controversies. But I actually wanted to start just in a very simple sense. It's all to, because we get so lost in the detail of particular issues, where they are, how they're going, and we're always at risk of getting lost in the wood for the trees. Whether you're talking about Australia or indeed any society, the two main aims, right? The prosperity and fairness, the size of the pie, and how we are slicing the pie up. I love the federal budget. I would classify myself as the biggest budget nerd in Australia. I love it because it is Australia's social compact, and it is all about how we band together as a nation, as a society, to chase those two key important goals. If you're thinking about that, of course, and you're looking at this, you might have noticed that one of the slices is just a little smaller than the others. Right? That's clearly the New Start slice of the pie. And if we were to go back and look at the same cake next year, well, as CEDA's pointed out, and indeed as Deloitte Access Economics has pointed out in relative terms, that particular slice would be even smaller still compared to the other slices. That's a fairness issue. I'm going to be talking today a chunk about prosperity, which to some extent requires talking about how the Australian economy is going. All right, the size of the pie, how fast is that growing? And you all know the answer there, and you know that it's a challenging one. You look at the growth in the production, how much extra Australia is making, output or real GDP, the most quoted statistic about the Australian economy. And you look at the growth in that over the last year, you can straight away see the challenge. Right? The growth rate in Australia today has dropped to the lowest that we've seen since the global financial crisis. Now, that's a challenge. And what we should and perhaps shouldn't do around that challenge is going to be the focus of what I talk about today. But it is perhaps worth me stepping through some of this. All right, there's a problem. Who is to blame for that problem? Well, again, you know, we have we immediately leap to the answer, right? We all know that it's down to the trade wars, and in essence, the Dumbo and the dictator. That bit was off the record, right? So for you up the back there, I didn't actually say that. Just to clarify, only kidding, only kidding. And it is true, right? This is particularly a challenge for the world economy. But it is probably also fair to say that the two things I've just mentioned, right, the real GDP growth rate, production, the output growth rate in Australia dropping to the lowest that we've seen in a decade, basically the lowest that we've seen since the global financial crisis, and the trade wars. It is a genuinely more complicated story than that. I used to work at Treasury. That was some time ago. And it wasn't until I left Treasury talks most about and thinks most about production, output, real GDP. It wasn't until I left and became part of the private sector that it gradually dawned on me. And so it's been decades. I don't talk much about GDP growth anymore. It might still dominate the headlines, but it certainly doesn't dominate my thinking or our thinking at Deloitte Access Economics. A much more relevant measure is national income and the growth in national income. If you look at where that is today versus that longer-term trend, right, 5.8% over the past year versus a longer-term trend of 4.5%, and you compare today to the global financial crisis, right? This is, again, you know, this is not the most quoted statistic, but it should be. The Australian story is more complicated, but it's also better in a bunch of ways than people have given it credit for. Why is that so? Well, one of the reasons, in fact, the main reason why we're getting national income growth going up at a time when output growth is going down are those trade wars. It actually turns out that, technical term, turns out that the world's largest beneficiary of the trade war to date has been Australia. Let me step through and explain that. So typically, how does a global downturn, and there is a global downturn, where growth has slowed around the globe. How does that usually hurt Australia? The main channel, the main way, is that as the world slows down, there are bits of the world economy that slow faster, typically, you know, manufacturing, broadly industrial production, business, all those very cyclical things, and it shows up most in the most cyclical thing of all, those commodity prices. What Australia does very differently to essentially any other rich nation around the world is we sell industrial inputs to the world's factories. And so in a downturn, those factories get hit the hardest, and the prices of the stuff, you know, the coal, the iron ore, and the rest of it, usually goes down. It goes down quite a lot. That's how we hurt. But that has not been happening. The main reason, and it's been building slowly, like the improvement in the budget balance, and for the same reason, it's been building slowly since the early months of 2016. As China has slowed, it has responded, right? Its politicians are under pressure. It's responded with stimulus, and most of the stimulus in China travels through the construction sector. construction needs steel. Steel needs coal and iron ore. Added to the fact that we had that tragedy, or a few tragedies, over in Brazil around mine safety, and the response of the Brazilians was to close down some of their production for a while. We've seen big increases in coal and iron ore prices. Things like gold prices have gone up as well. They're off their peaks, but they're still pretty high. It turns out that for all we worry, and you know, I'm going to be clear because I'll get to this, it's the heart of what we do next. There are lots of things to worry about, and I certainly wouldn't pretend otherwise. But you do the stock take as of today, and Australia's easily been the world's biggest winner from those trade wars. And much of what we're thinking about, you know, as the problem, is genuinely not the problem. Which does, of course, raise the question of what has been doing the damage. Two things, right? The drought, which was slipping off the front page, it's starting to come back because it hasn't gone away. And it is, you know, and this is again is an old story. A big drought causes a chunk of damage to the Australian economy. It's caused about a third of the slowdown in production in Australia. Two-thirds of the trouble, the bulk of the trouble, is housing. From about late October onwards, house price falls in Australia accelerated. There was a substantial phase where the average home in both Sydney and Melbourne was losing value by $2,000 a week. This was, and again, using the jargon, the technical jargon, the housing, I don't really want to call it a bubble, but it was certainly close to a bubble. It was always going to bite Australia on the bum, you know, because those prices divorced a long way from fundamentals, from gravity, if you like, and gravity eventually caught up with that stupidity. And as it did, and as those housing price falls began to accelerate, that did two things. You know, so you see the bottom one, you know, fewer apartments getting built at the moment, although that took time to, you know, because there was this big pipeline of stuff getting built. The faster thing to happen, you know, housing is a small bit, housing construction is sort of 5% of the Australian economy. Retail spending is 25%, and more widely, consumer spending is over half the Australian economy. And as the wealth of consumers began to go down, there was a lot of fear around that. You saw consumers become more careful, right? You know, so we pulled back on our spending, and as always, it was the discretionary stuff. So car sales are down 10% today on where they were a year ago. You know, a lot of discretionary spending is where the pain was felt, or you look geographically. Retail turnover in New South Wales has barely budged today from where it was a year ago. Or in other words, the housing downturn did two things. It made consumers more cautious, right? Their wealth was going down, they were more cautious. And it's showing up in the pace at which we're building new homes and renovating old ones. That has been what's been causing the damage here in Australia. All right, well, what next? We already know that there's a bunch of stimulus. I would go so far as to say heaps of stimulus. House prices are, as we know, rebounding now. That's a problem longer term. We had a housing affordability problem. It was getting better. Now it's getting worse. You know, I mentioned we went through a number of months from late October you know, well into 2019. We saw those average homes in Sydney and Melbourne losing value at $2,000 a week. Last month, they were back to rising at $1,500 a week. There's some data out, just out from CoreLogic last week. The average house, the median house value in Sydney rose $4,000, and in Melbourne it rose $3,000. To be clear, this is actually, you know, the hair of the dog that bit us. and there are dangers around that. But in the short term, it's part of what is putting something of a floor under the Australian economy. The drought, the drought isn't going away, but we're talking about growth rates. And in fact, the current estimate is that this year's winter crop will be 10 or 11% better than last year's winter crop. Or in other words, it goes from being something that's worsening growth to something that ever so slightly is helping growth. We've had 2 interest rate cuts, and we'll get more. We'll get another 2, maybe another 3 interest rate cuts. We've had tax cuts. That's rolling into people's pockets. The Australian dollar is down about 10% on where it was 2 years ago. That's not a bad combination. That is enough to, in a grand sense, do nothing, right? It's enough to leave the unemployment rate around about where it is, 5.25%. It's enough to leave wage growth at about 2.25%. Or in other words, it's enough to keep the Australian economy muddling through. Now that's a disappointment to a bunch of people. Muddling through, you'd kind of think, well, is that the best we can do? And the obvious question is, well, what's the alternative? Does anybody have the cunning plan? And of course that's not a picture of Phil Lowe, but it is true that the Reserve Bank does have a cunning plan. And it has to have a plan because something unusual is happening in Australia and around the world. Right? And it's the same story here and globally. You're seeing interest rates getting cut, but essentially for the first time ever, interest rates are getting cut for 2 reasons, not one reason. Not because economies are slower, but the other reason, the thing that people really don't understand is growth is showing up here and around the world differently to how it used to. These days it shows up more in jobs and less in wages than it used to. The trade-off between, in particular, unemployment and hence wages and prices, inflation, that trade-off has shifted. The Reserve Bank put up its hand and said, well, hang on, we used to think it took an unemployment rate of 5% to get wages moving faster. Now we think 4.5%. Now, it came to that conclusion at a time, and it's the same conclusion globally, that's shifted at a time when economies had slowed. And so as the Reserve Bank cuts rates here, or you see equivalents overseas, 2 things are happening. Imagine we're driving along in a car, the speed limit is 60 k's, but the car's drifted down to 50, and so we put a foot on the accelerator, right? That's the traditional reason we're seeing central banks respond to a slowdown. The other thing, though, is that the central banks in the world, the Reserve Bank has looked up and, hang on, we thought we were in a 60 zone. We're actually in a 70 zone. And so they're putting their foot on the accelerator even harder. To get from where we are, our unemployment rate of 5.25, to where you have to be to move wages along, to address the 2 things, the 2 I called it muddling through. The unemployment rate basically doesn't improve. Wage growth doesn't improve. In fact, on our forecasts, we're still working through in response to the national accounts, but wage growth, if anything, edges down slightly in the next little while. This would address those 2 things, right? To get from 5.25% unemployment down to 4.5%, you need about 200,000 extra jobs. That's 100,000 people off the unemployment queues and 100,000 people retiring later or coming back into the workforce earlier, all those things. And it would, we're talking by definition about something that would be very good for those 200,000 people, particularly for the 100,000 who'd be moving off New Start. It would be good across the 12 million workers in Australia who would be better off as a result of that. Now, how much do you need to move a dial? Now's when I take a moment to check my watch and see how I'm going on the timing, on the grounds that those lights are really quite impressive. So there is a clock up there, but I can't see it. How much do you need to move are the levers to get an extra 200,000 jobs in Australia? Well, let me talk about two levers. One of them is just interest rates, and the other is just infrastructure spending. And these results come out of our modelling. We have a beautiful economic model at Deloitte Access Economics, but they're broadly consensus results. Right? If you were just using interest rates to create an extra 200,000 jobs, you would need to cut interest rates about 3 percentage points, which is a problem if the cash rate today is 1%. All right, you know, so you've got the Reserve Bank saying, well, we can't do this ourselves. You know, they've explicitly noted, well, they could do, I'll call it with inverted quotes, you know, printing money. They could do the fancy stuff. And we know the fancy stuff helps. We also know there is a risk that the fancy stuff is kind of better at pumping up share markets and housing prices than it is pumping up economies. But it does help, right? So interest rates, 3 percentage points, which we don't have. Say the only lever, say the Reserve Bank was out of this equation and the only lever we were using to get an extra 200,000 jobs was infrastructure. You would have to essentially triple the amount of infrastructure, so public and publicly funded infrastructure spending in Australia today. And we know there are some challenges around. There's certainly, you know, a bunch of projects that we should do. Not necessarily some of those on the agenda. You know, cost benefit is the key, but there's a bunch of particularly smaller projects that you can do. Some of them, you know, you look at Sydney and Melbourne though, and there are some capacity constraints there. All right, so that's this is what here's the Reserve Bank plan. Here's the kind of levers, and that's why the conversation there is essentially saying, you know, Reserve Bank needs to do more, and it is doing more, and it's looking to the federal government, or perhaps the federal government, to push along the state governments to come to the party. But it's just hard. It's hard but doable. I just want to sit again the conversation though in a wider context, because a bunch of people are assuming, well, that's what we should do, and we're dumb if we don't. And I just want to take you back. You know, there's two aims, prosperity and fairness. I typically say sustainable prosperity and fairness because I want to bring in environment and global warming, but there's a sustainability question here too. If you think about the Reserve Bank plan versus the government plan, which is essentially doing what they're doing or no further stimulus, as you weigh up those alternatives, as you think through the costs and benefits, this is essentially an insurance discussion. All right? So we are talking about an obviously, you know, there are clear gains if you shift policy to get an extra 200,000 people in jobs and wages moving faster than they are at the moment. Clear gains, right? What do you lose? Well, to some extent, you lose a bit of wriggle room. You know, if the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates close to zero and starts printing money, if the Feds pitch in and fiscal policy substantially assists, and we get to that 4.5, you know, and it's all great, but just remember that nobody knows the future, and that risks and uncertainties, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, they continue to rise, right? All sorts of stuff. You know, you worry about Brexit, you worry about trade wars, you worry about Hong Kong, you should worry more about India and Pakistan. Iran is backed into a corner and its punches are starting to be a little on the wild side. So as you kind of think, well, you know, is this the right thing to do, the Reserve Bank? And so many people assume yes. I would simply say, roll forward 5 years when we will know, and if we're looking back and we say, well, okay, we did what the Reserve Bank suggested and the government, and we got all those good things. We got the extra 200,000, we got wages moving faster, and there wasn't a crisis in the meantime. Well, it will have been the right thing to do. If, however, the bad thing happens, if the world does throw a recession at Australia across that 5 years. And we've kind of cashed in a chunk of our recession insurance. Now, you know, there are technical limits in particular on how much printing money can achieve. There are political limits, so you know there would be people in the room. Certainly, good economists would say, "Well, it doesn't really matter if the federal government is in, you know, much of a deficit. When the crisis hits, it can get an even bigger deficit." That is entirely correct in a technical sense. It is less correct in a tabloid sense. The politics of fiscal stimulus are a lot easier the better is that budget position. So I'd simply make that point. You know, if somebody is kind of saying to you that it's obvious what should happen now, what I would say is that it is a question of risk management. We don't know. We don't know who's right. The more the risks and uncertainties rise, and even in just the last 3 months they've risen, I would say the holding back a little, keeping that little, you know, keeping that insurance. If anything, the value of that option has continued to rise in recent months. Bad things are happening, but they haven't actually, you know, think about Australian national income. They haven't really hit yet. They could. There are dangers, which does, of course, you know, raise the question. I'm kind of making it clear what I would do. This audience in particular would understand that there are two types of economists. There are the economists who you know, they love their Kenny Rogers. There's a surprising amount of them. Whereas, of course, I am your Bob Seger type. and when I think about that trade-off and that insurance, and do we hang on to a bit of wriggle room, I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. The tragedies of my lifetime have been recessions, right? They are, again, to be technical, god-awful. And the Australian experience, or indeed the American experience more recently in the global financial crisis, was that if you lose your job and you don't get that job back, within 2 years, then you're essentially on the scrap heap forever. So that having that room to manoeuvre, Churchill becomes Prime Minister and France is collapsing, and he races over to France and he says, well, you know, where are the reserves? And he's told there are none. It's a complicated decision. That's the debate, right, that Australia should be having at the moment. We can do better. The Reserve Bank is right. We can do better. And they may be entirely right that we should do better, that we should push on the monetary and fiscal accelerators more. But we don't really know that, and as the risks and uncertainties rise, I must admit I'm not uncomfortable with where policy is at the moment, which is, of course, a dangerous note on which to finish. Thank you very much.
Why don't you take a seat so we can have a little yarn. You're lucky we haven't got a little table here and a glass of red wine, because we'd just be going all afternoon, I suspect. I hope everyone else picked up on the tone in Chris's voice when he talked about his beautiful model. Spoken like an economist, wasn't it? Like he was referring to that model like it was, you know, a shiny...
A living thing.
Yeah, like a shiny red Corvette or something. I appreciate that. I'm going to be, I'm going to attempt to be a somewhat gracious host and offer the first slice of the Chris Richardson cake to the audience. So who is out there ready to ask a question? Because I've got questions on my screen. Right up the back, thank you.
Hi, Chris. Darren Disney from BP. In regards to the 200,000 target, there was monetary policy, there was infrastructure spending, but just interested in your thoughts on tax cuts as a lever.
Sure, and you can do that too. And it does remind me, I actually left off something the Reserve Bank said, economic reforms. And And there is a difference between tax cuts and tax reforms, and indeed tax reforms aren't the only type of reforms. I should just briefly mention why I left that off. You know, I'm a fully paid up member of the Economic Reform Club. I entirely agree with the Governor of the Reserve Bank that that's a logical thing to do. As I say, you know, there's more than tax reforms you can do. You can do federal-state reforms, you can do city reforms, you can do competition reforms, all those sorts of things that the Australian electorate seems to be uncomfortable with. So I'd merely note that if it's not just tax cuts, but actually genuinely tax reforms, and they're mostly different things, then there are tricky conversations to be had before we get there. And the other thing about economic reforms is that they, you know, will often have 10 years or more as a payoff period. So if our problem is right now that growth is weaker and unemployment is edging up, though still low by the standard of recent decades, and that wage and price growth is not where the Reserve Bank would like to see it. You know, yeah, there's a bunch of things I shouldn't have left off. Tax cuts, that's one of the other more active proposals around things you could do to get things moving. In terms of bang for buck, so you spend a given dollar of government money, federal or state, and you're looking for jobs. I would rank infrastructure ahead of tax cuts, and I would rank equal with infrastructure, or perhaps even better, raising the unemployment benefit in Australia. I did throw in a gratuitous something at the start, but it is, when I talk about the two aims of any society, of prosperity and fairness, the fundamental fairness fail in Australia is in and around the unemployment benefit. And history, I'm getting older, you know, the question is, how will history judge us? How have we done? And that's one, and it's really hard to, you know, so any retired politician will agree immediately. The ones actually out there now, they're the, you know, this is the very hardest lever to move. Sure, I shortcut the discussion by just mentioning infrastructure, tax cuts, true, New Start as well. I would probably rank bringing forward the second tranche of the tax cuts part of the conversation. I'd rank that in terms of its job creation abilities a little lower.
Chris, I'm just going to jump in here and just summarise what I think was what you were saying around risk and whether we and the insurance, whether we use our insurance option now. So my sense of what you're saying is keep our powder dry for now. When you look at the magnitude of interest rate cuts that you're flagging to sort of kickstart a roughly 250,000 new jobs, what value the next interest rate cut then? Like, are you in the camp of thinking that further interest rate cuts from here actually make any difference? And how? I mean, and there's the direct sort of real impact and the confidence impact.
Yeah. And particularly thanks for raising the confidence impact. So at some point, of course, cutting interest rates doesn't move the economy along. Oh, sorry, cutting cash rates doesn't move the economy along because it moves the economy along because the banks basically cut the rates they pay to depositors so they can cut what they charge from the people who are borrowing from them. But as more and more deposit rates hit zero, there's a point at which a cash rate cut doesn't help. There are other reasons to think that interest rates, each additional one may not be quite as much of a bang as before. Confidence is an even better point. As I say, in Australia and around the world, interest rates have been cut for two reasons. In Australia and around the world, the public, Mr. and Mrs. Suburbs, does not understand that. And central banks, and I include the Reserve Bank among this, has not explained itself well. I use the analogy, we're driving along the car slowed from 60 to 50, and we're going to step on the accelerator. Then we realised, well, hang on, the speed limit is 70, so we're pushing even harder on the accelerator. This is a global story. Growth now shows up more in jobs and less in wages than it used to. And if it shows up less in wages, it shows up less in prices. There is a speed limit, there's a change. The world's central banks can move economies along faster for a while, and they want to, before wages take off, which is how you get prices taking off. But if all you're hearing from central bank is cut, 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 then people have an entire lifetime of experience that says central banks are cutting because the economy is bad. Neighbours are stopping me in the street, and it takes a lot of courage to stop an economist, right?
Well, especially if you've got somewhere to be that day.
Because it takes time. It just takes time. You know, they're really worried. The economy must be going to hell in a handbasket. The Reserve Bank is pounding out the cuts. And I do think that most of the commentary around this has failed to miss the point. Now, that is the problem of the Reserve Bank. They own this. Right? This is the first time in your experience, and mine, even mine, in which the Reserve Bank is cutting interest rates for two reasons, but the public is only hearing one reason. So consumer confidence this week went to a 2-year low, and a chunk of that is because we're not having the right conversation around what's happening.
Question here, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Michael Hartman from Skills Impact. Your productivity chart, we've got our own model inside of Skills Impact, our version of our red Corvette. You lift up the bonnet, there's nothing under it, but the concept is that low productivity, a key contributor is low quality of skill development in Australia. Is there some sort of holy grail where a stimulus could be aimed at lifting skills and boosting productivity?
In terms of long-term prosperity, a skilled Australia is a prosperous Australia. I've travelled Australia a bit this weekend and have done a bunch of speeches. This has been the first one on the economy. Every other single presentation has been on skills, and Deloitte has done a lot of work around that. And you know, for the first time in Australia that this has been done, we actually didn't look at jobs, you know, how many electricians do we have versus how many do we need, how many bankers do we have, you know the answer. They actually looked at, so to do any job well requires about 18 skills. You know, don't look electrician or banker or lawyer, whatever it is. You know, look at the underlying skills. And our very detailed look at the data is fascinating. Broadly, a decade ago, you know, again, you need 18 skills to do the typical job well. Australians were short, the Australian workforce was short about 1.2 of those skills. It's now at the point that we're short 2 out of the 18 skills to do it well. The world, technologies, but not just technologies, are changing fast and changing what the workplace needs of its workforce. And we're too busy, you know, getting worried about foreigners and robots. True in Australia, true around the world. Those fears are dominating rather than doing the stuff around the future that we should do. The key is the better skills. But what I would say is the best, you know, so economists long figured out that getting early education right was the main thing. This research shows that, in a sense, getting late education right is the missing element. Beautiful analysis, the relevant analysis. 50 years ago, those very well-known economists, Crosby, Stills and Nash, who said, love the one you're with, all right? Always been magnificent advice. On the job training, right? The IMF is saying it, the OECD is saying it, it's cheaper, it's more focused, you know, all those things. On the job training, we're not doing enough in Australia. And if you asked me of one lever I would love to see the federal government, and it's hard to get the policy settings right to support better on-the-job training. I was talking to the public service this morning. You know, one way or another, governments employ essentially a third of the Australian, they can do stuff directly. But that stuff, better on-the-job training and supporting that, would be a beautiful thing for the longer term.
So a question here, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Thanks.
Yeah, Alex Serrano from BDO. Thank you, Chris. Chris, I think you did a remarkably good job in.
Sorry, what was it?
Sorry, a remarkably good job. It's a splendid job.
Please feel free to Twitter that.
Yeah. Shall I stop there?
No, go.
I think you did a remarkably good job in describing what is essentially a counterintuitive insight, that despite essentially anemic global growth and what one might think would occur with a big stoush between the dictator and the what was it?
Dumbo.
The Dumbo. Don't Twitter that. Nevertheless, instead of being harmed by that experience, Australia's economy essentially has benefited from it. So that was a terrific insight. So thank you for that, and we can tweet that as well. But I wonder whether that means Australia still falls prey to, again, the great. We've done another great Bradbury. Essentially by doing nothing, by an abundance of caution, and sort of lightly trimming the sails, steady as she goes. We've navigated another disaster, and again, by the grace of God, we're not Argentina again, and you hear a bit about that. But I wonder whether that's a prescription for long-term success or more a reliance on dumb luck. And when you look at the broader picture, the question I have is, does national growth really rely upon swimming with the tide of global economic changes because we're so small and we're going to be thrown around? Or does it rely on transforming an economy by understanding national fundamentals and major global trends and trying to be a little bit proactive in that? And that reform agenda that we saw decades ago when I was a pretty young person, it's not something that seems to be part of the national discourse to any great degree. And I've led up my question is, do you think the time for major structural reform in the Australian economy is gone?
And it is much harder now for a range of reasons. You're right. Australia is doing better than most people think at the moment because of luck. The lucky country got lucky again. Shows up most notably in the budget. A handful of years ago it was running at a $40 billion a year deficit. It's back to balance, not because Canberra took tricky decisions, and certainly not because Canberra did many reforms, but because we got lucky. Australia and the world could be governed better. Our national conversations, and that's, CEDA is magnificent again around that, and an important institution amongst our other institutions, the Productivity Commission, the Parliamentary Budget Office, the Public Service, more broadly, a judiciary, or equivalents around the world, and I would love to add Deloitte Access Economics. National conversations are getting worse, right? Because populists all over the world and in Australia are preying on the classic two fears, foreigners and robots. It's made harder still by the fact that we've already done a bunch of the big hit reforms, but you could do more. I mentioned cities reform. I mentioned tax reform, federal state reform, competition reform. Infrastructure, the first thing that the federal government should do is actually price and regulate our infrastructure better. We use it terribly. Better electricity pricing, a neg in energy would be a great example. Congestion pricing of roads in CBDs. Largest bit of infrastructure in Australia is the trillions of dollars we have invested in housing occupied by little old ladies in the suburbs because we have a tax and transfer system that begs them to do that. We can do better. It does, it involves CEDA, it involves all those other institutions that I said. It's now harder to do reforms, but the potential payoff from them, in a grand sense, are greater. Each of you, one way or another, are a part of the national conversation. Our task is getting harder. We have to fight harder to rise to it. Thanks.
What a great question and answer to finish on. I'm just going to say that we had one question on the app that I just want to come back to. It was a question about Newstart and funding Newstart. Deloitte Access Economics has done I'm going to jump in on your behalf here. Deloitte Access Economics has done some fantastic work that essentially shows you can debt fund this out of the budget and would actually be net positive to the economy. Roughly right?
Net positive to the economy and the cost of the budget pretty small. $3 billion direct cost, but net of extra tax collections, $1 billion a year.
So Chris has been
yes.
Chris has been a strong advocate for this for some time. So if you go and have a look on their website, you'll find the report, and it's pretty compelling and comprehensive. Chris, as always, thank you very much for an engaging and interesting presentation, and always bring at least a handful of insights, I think, to the audience. So could you join me in thanking Chris Richardson?